Hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to see you here, my dear friends. If you want to improve your English, you're in the right place. Today we're going to talk about a very special topic. This video might be one of the most meaningful videos you've ever watched on our channel. Because today I'm going to tell you the story of women. But we won't just talk about today. We're going to start from thousands of years ago. We're going to talk about how women have lived since the very beginning of humanity and where they stand today. If you're ready, let's begin. Now close your eyes for a second. Imagine yourself in a very, very distant time, thousands of years ago. No concrete around you, no cars, no phones, just forests, mountains, and sky. Imagine small groups of people wandering around, people lighting fires and hunting animals. This is humanity in its earliest form. And where were women in this period? What were they doing? Let's talk about that today. We call this time the hunter-gatherer period. People were not planting or harvesting. They were not settling in one place. They were constantly on the move. They went wherever there was food. They followed animals. When they found fruit, they collected it. They ate roots, insects, whatever they could find. And during this period, believe me, the difference between men and women was not as large as it is today. Did you know? Scientists studied hunter-gatherer communities for many years. They studied bones. They studied old campsites, they studied cave paintings, and they discovered this. Women were very active during this period. Women were not just sitting in tents waiting, just raising children as people might think today. Women went outside too. Women searched for food too. In fact, in some communities, women went hunting too. The most important job of women during that period was gathering, that is, collecting edible things from forests, fields, and riverbanks. Research shows that in hunter-gatherer communities, more than 60% of the food the group ate came from what women gathered. So women held a very important place in these communities. Women didn't only do gathering. They were also a great treasure of knowledge. Which plant is poisonous? Which plant is edible? Which root is good for illness? Which leaf heals a wound? Women knew this very well. They passed this knowledge from generation to generation. Grandmothers taught their grandchildren. Mothers taught their daughters. Without this knowledge, the community could not survive. And think about this. During this period, there was no property. No one had a house, land, or animals. Everything was shared. They lived as a group, ate as a group, moved as a group. And because of this, the balance of power between men and women was much more equal. A man might be physically stronger than a woman, but a woman had knowledge, the ability to give birth. A woman's role within the community was very valuable. Without women, the community could not grow. Of course, this period had its difficulties too. Life was very hard. Every day you had to fight to survive. There were wild animals. There was illness. There was hunger. There was cold. And women had to deal with all of this, give birth, take care of children, and gather food. It wasn't easy for them. But women were strong, they were resilient, and they were essential to the community. Now let's fast forward a little. About 12,000 years ago, something happened. One of the greatest changes in the history of humanity. People discovered agriculture. They realized that when a seed was planted in the soil, it would grow and bear fruit. They learned that animals could be domesticated, that instead of following them, they could keep them nearby. and this changed everything. With agriculture, people began to settle down. They no longer had to migrate. Villages were built. Fields were opened. Shelters were made for animals. Now there was property. This field is mine. These animals are mine. This house is mine. And right at this point, women's lives began to change. In the early days of the agricultural period, women were still active. They worked in the fields despite difficult conditions. In fact, research shows that in some regions it was women who first discovered and practiced farming, because that deep knowledge about plants belonged to women. Women knew best how each seed would grow. But the world kept changing. As communities grew, villages turned into cities. As the concept of property grew stronger, women began to become less and less visible. Especially wars began. One community wanted to take another's fields and animals. In every society, warriors became important. These warriors were usually men. Physical strength, armor, using weapons, these became men's territory. With this change, women were slowly pushed back into the home. Now the outside world was men's territory. Fields, markets, politics, war, these were men's business. Home, children, cooking, these were women's business. This separation became so strong over time that it started to look as if it had always been this way, as if it were natural, as if women belonged inside and men belonged outside. And think about this. With agriculture, lineage became very important. Who will you leave your land, your animals, your wealth to? To your son. But to make sure your son is truly your son, what do you need? You need the woman to belong only to you. This thinking restricted women even further. Women's freedom, women's movements were brought under control, because the transfer of property made women's loyalty seem necessary. This is, of course, a very painful truth. Women slowly began to be seen as property. A father would give his daughter to another man. He would receive money or something else in return. The woman would go to her husband's home. She now belonged to her husband. Her connection to her own family would weaken, and this system continued for centuries. Of course, not every culture was the same. In some parts of the world, women had more freedom. Some societies showed more respect to women. But the general picture, especially in the great civilizations, became increasingly restrictive for women. Now let's take a look at the situation in the Middle Ages. This period, especially for Europe, was truly a very difficult time for women. The church was very powerful during this period. The church's view of women was not very encouraging. Women were weak. Women were more prone to sin. Women needed the guidance of men. These ideas seeped into society. What was a woman's life like in the Middle Ages? If you were a peasant, you woke up early in the morning. You fed the animals. You woke up the children. You cooked food. You worked in the fields. You came home and cooked again. You took care of the children, and you went to sleep late at night. No holidays, no rest. If you were from a noble family, things were a little different. Your freedom was still limited. Among the nobility, girls were promised to other families from a young age to be married off. Marriage was not a matter of love, it was a political agreement. Women were used to strengthen the alliance between two families. Two states would ignore women for the sake of their political interests, reading, education. This was a dream for most women. Even knowing how to read and write was a privilege. Usually only nuns living in monasteries could get an education. But ordinary peasant women, or even many noble women, did not know how to read or write, because there was no need for it. A woman's job was the home, not books. Also, in the late Middle Ages and early modern period, hundreds of thousands of women were accused of witchcraft, especially in Europe. The vast majority of these women were actually women who made herbal medicines, women who were midwives, women who lived alone, women who were a little different from society, women without husbands, women who lived independently, women who did not obey others, were looked upon with suspicion. These accusations often ended in death. Of course, there were some brave women who emerged during this period too. Names that shone in the darkness of history, like Joan of Arc, a young girl who fought for France, who led an army. What happened to her in the end? She was burned, like Hildegard von Bingen, a nun who made music, wrote poetry, and compiled medical knowledge. But these were exceptions. Their stories reached us today because they were incredibly successful. The stories of millions of women, however, were lost. They lived quietly. They passed on quietly. As time went on, a wind of change began to blow. The Renaissance came, the Enlightenment came, science advanced, the printing press was invented. People began to read books. They began to question things. During this process, some women also began to raise their voices. People no longer had such rigid ways of thinking. In the 17th and 18th centuries, some women writers emerged. Those who said women should also have the right to education. Those who argued that women's thoughts were also valuable. Mary Wollstonecraft is one of the most important figures of this period. In a book she wrote in 1792, she defended women's rights. She said women are not foolish, they are simply uneducated. She said, give women opportunity and they will be just as successful as men. Saying these things in that era required a lot of courage. Years passed. The Industrial Revolution came. The world order was about to change again. In the late 18th and 19th centuries, factories began to be built. Steam engines, textile factories, coal mines. Workers were needed to work in these factories. A large number of workers were needed. Employers realized that women and children worked for lower wages. It was very easy to exploit them. So millions of women left their homes and entered the factories. This was not a liberation. This was another form of exploitation. You entered the factory early in the morning. You left when it was already dark in the evening. You worked 12, 14, even 16 hours in front of dangerous machines, in dusty, noisy, airless environments. And the wage you received was not even half of what a man received. Children also worked in these factories. Because their small hands could reach into narrow spaces, children worked in coal mines. Children worked at weaving looms. These children worked side by side with their mothers in those factories, because they had no other choice. And right at this point, something began to stir. Women were no longer suffering alone. They were suffering together. They were working in the same factories. They were sharing the same problems. They began to talk. They began to organize. They wanted to defend their rights. These uprisings began to grow over time. A great era was knocking on the door of the historical stage. Now let's come to a very important date. The year 1908. New York City. A cold winter day. We still feel the effects of what happened on that day today. Thousands of women were working in New York's textile factories. The vast majority had immigrated from Europe. They had wanted to build a better life in America. America, however, had not given them a very warm welcome. These women entered the factory every morning. Bosses sometimes locked the doors. Why? So they wouldn't leave without permission and take a break. This was not a safety measure, it was like a prison. Working conditions were very difficult. Wages were low. Child workers worked alongside them. And if you didn't please your employer, if you said something, if you complained, you would be fired. And hundreds of women were waiting at the door to take your place. Women had no other choice. In March 1908, women textile workers in New York came together. They took to the streets. They marched. What did they want? They wanted these things: shorter working hours, better wages, no more child labor, and the right to vote. Yes, at that time in America, women did not have the right to vote. In 1908, women in New York could not vote. Women had no right to vote anywhere in the world. This march brought thousands of women together. They marched through the city streets. They carried banners. They chanted slogans. The police tried to disperse them. Some were arrested, but they did not give up. This action created a huge impact around the world. Newspapers wrote about it. People talked. And this spark began to grow. After this march, the world began to change. People's perspectives began to change. The next stop of this change was 1910, Copenhagen, Denmark. A very important meeting was held in this city. The meeting was called the International Socialist Women's Conference. Women from different countries around the world came together, from Germany, France, Russia, Austria, England, and many more places. More than 100 women from 17 countries. These women sat at the table and talked. What are our problems? How will we solve these problems? How can we become stronger? At this meeting, a German woman stepped forward. Her name was Clara Zetkin. This woman was one of the most powerful women's activists of that era. She took the stage and said this: "We women should have a day that we celebrate every year, a day dedicated only to women. On that day we will take to the streets. On that day we will raise our voices. On that day we will demand our rights." And this idea was applauded by everyone in the hall. It was accepted unanimously. Clara Zetkin's proposal planted the seed of the March 8th we celebrate today. So behind this day there is not just a date. Behind this day there are real people, real struggles, real lives. Clara Zetkin is the pioneer of all of them. So what happened after the conference? In 1911, Women's Day was celebrated for the first time in several European countries, in Austria, Denmark, Germany, and Switzerland. Millions of women took to the streets. Marches were held. Rallies were organized. And what did these women want? They wanted the right to vote. They wanted the right to work. They wanted equal pay. They wanted the right to education. These things that seem so normal to us today were dreams back then, and those women marched for those dreams. In 1917, another development occurred. We're going to Russia. The year 1917. Russia. World War I is ongoing. Russia is suffering very heavy losses in this war. Russia is in a difficult situation and cannot get support from its allies. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers are dying at the front. Men are being sent to war. Who is left behind? Women, children, the elderly. The lives of those who remain have become unbearable. Women are waiting in bread lines for hours to be able to feed their children. On March 8, 1917, an uprising broke out. Women workers working in Petrograd's textile factories united. They took the male workers in their own factories along with them. They poured into the streets. They said, "We want bread, the war must end." They said, "Women are not valued, we want change." That day, there were approximately 90,000 people in the streets of the city. The next day, 200,000. The day after that, even more. The protests grew rapidly. These protests changed the course of history. All these uprisings ignited the fuse of the Russian Revolution. The Tsar stepped down from the throne. Everything in Russia changed. Women workers struck the spark that set off one of the greatest revolutions in history. Women who wanted bread. Mothers who wanted to feed their children. After these events, Russia's new government declared March 8th an official holiday. Around the world, however, it would take many more years for this day to be recognized. For decades, this day was celebrated in some countries and was not even known in others. At first, most countries did not pay much attention to it, but women kept celebrating. In 1977, the United Nations stepped in. The United Nations, the world's largest international organization, officially declared March 8th as International Women's Day. This was a very important moment, because now this day was no longer just a matter for a few countries. From that point on, this day could be celebrated in every corner of the world. It had official legitimacy. With this legitimacy, March 8th began to spread around the world. This is how March 8th came to be. If you look at how March 8th is celebrated today, you see a very interesting picture, a little different in every country. In most countries, March 8th is an official holiday. In Western Europe and America, this day is celebrated a little differently. It is known more as an awareness day. Conferences are organized, panels are held, women's rights are discussed, successful women are highlighted. Companies appreciate their female employees. In recent years in Latin American countries, hundreds of thousands of women take to the streets in Argentina, Mexico, Colombia. They carry banners. They sing songs. They dance. 100 years ago, women in many countries did not have the right to vote. Now they do. 100 years ago, women could not work in the job they wanted. Now they largely can. 100 years ago, women could not go to university. Now in many countries, there are more women than men in universities. This is a great achievement. The efforts of the women who fought for this cause, the people who made that history, are immense. I have a very strange feeling inside me while sharing this video with you. On one hand, I am very hopeful, because knowing this story, knowing the struggle of these women is very beautiful. On the other hand, I feel a sense of responsibility, because this struggle is not over yet, and it is everyone's duty to continue this struggle. When March 8th comes, buy a flower for the woman you love. This is a very beautiful gesture. March 8th is not just Women's Day. This day is humanity's day. Because a more just world is not a better world just for women. It's a better world for everyone. Let's not forget that. That's all from us for today, my dear friends. Thank you so very much for watching this video. In the coming period, we will be publishing videos about the life stories of women who changed the course of history. Happy International Women's Day, March 8th.